So kia ora and welcome to 2 to the power of 5, the power of queer words, brought to you by the same but different literary festival, which is Aotearoa's only LGBTQI plus rainbow queer literary festival. My name is Sam Orchard and I'm the host for today. Our festival usually happens during Pride, but we're hosting the special online free winter series because it's 2020 and things are chaos. We're very, very grateful to our sponsors, Creative New Zealand, who has allowed us to put this festival on. And I'm very, very excited to host Nevo ZISIN and Lil O'BRIEN for our session today on memoir writing. I thought that maybe I hand it over to you both to introduce yourselves and say a little bit about your experience with memoir writing.
Oh God. Okay, well, I'll start. I am Lil. My book is called Not That I'd Kiss a Girl, which, spoiler alert, I did. And it just came out a few weeks ago with Alan and Unwin in New Zealand, and we had an awesome launch party / piss up. That was great. So basically, it's a book that I've been writing since I was in my early 20s. And it's really a deep dive into my coming out story. So it's quite focused on that process, which was quite a process for me. And it kind of has two narrative threads. One is the empowering, the empowerment that I felt as I learned more and more about myself and came out to my peers. And then it kind of has a narrative conflict that runs through, which is my parents accidentally outing myself to my parents well before I was ready, and kind of the fallout that happened from that when they weren't accepting.
Wow, it sounds amazing. I can't wait to read it. I'm Nevo ZISIN. I'm coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne in Australia, and I'm standing on the colonised and unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I'd like to pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. My book is called Finding Nevo, or Finding Nevo, if you will. I published it 3 years ago now, and it's a memoir on everything, I guess, involved in growing up. I think that it's, very focused on my transition and being assigned female at birth and coming out as queer in high school and then transitioning in year 12. But it's also just about the usual things that you kind of deal with as a teenager, body image issues and bullying and coming to terms with sexuality, which is, I think, a process everyone goes through, whether it's queerness or not. And I did write it in my early 20s. So it was published when I was 21. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I thought that we would start off with a process question. How did you both go about the process of, I guess, from the beginning of deciding that you wanted to write memoir, and then how do you kind of tell a story? What was your process of going back through your memories and deciding what to put in and what to leave out, and how to do that and feel good about that process, I guess?
It's such a great question, I think, and maybe like Lil, you've experienced this already, but I think as queer writers, we're actually very rarely asked about our craft or our processes. The first question I get is like, so what's it like being trans? Or what does this mean? Or how can we be better allies? And I have to centralize the entire conversation of writing on education about really kind of usually basic terms. So to be asked about craft is really exciting and great. Thank you. I think for me, I was so afraid because I happened to get a book deal at a really young age, which was amazing and not really something that happens all that often, but it also really, I think, compounded my imposter syndrome because I was convinced that I definitely was an imposter. I was writing at 19 years old. Who was I to write a memoir? No one knew anything about me and didn't care, and why should they? So I didn't write for a really long time. And then my publisher was sort of like, it's fine that you haven't written for 4 months, but your deadline's not moving. So you need to start. So a lot of red wine, really. And I think similar to any other genre, memoir is one that you still need to do research, but what the research will look like might be really different to a fiction or a historical fiction book, for example. So the research that I did was actually going through my Facebook from the very time that I first got it, going through old photos and actually trying to reimagine and reinsert myself into the people that I used to be. It was a really deep process of reconnecting with myself across different life cycles and incarnations. And I think that process was really healing and really cathartic and also really re-traumatizing. I felt like I had to relive every single trauma that I had experienced so that I could speak to them with authenticity and not, you know, like I could hear the voices of my 13-year-old self when I would write about them. And then they would just be like, that's not what I would have said, or that's not how I acted. And I would have to correct myself. So yeah, it was healing, cathartic, and re-traumatizing, I think.
Yeah, I would agree on both, well, all of that really, but firstly, it is nice to be asked about process. I've been asked how to solve homophobia, which I was like, I don't know. He was like, well, you know, here's what I'd say, visibility. And I was like, okay, visibility. It's like, do you want the short one word or do you want a long thing about it? And yeah, I write for a job as well, as a copywriter. So it is, process is actually quite interesting because the process for copywriting and for writing a memoir has its similarities and its differences. And I think that being a copywriter really fed into the tone and the way my memoir is written. I think as copywriters, we learn to pull people through a piece of copy without losing them along the way. So it's kind of about flow and pacing. And also we learn about like catching attention from the beginning, which I think influenced my chapter openings. So part of the process was figuring, okay, well, here's the story I want to tell in this chapter. Here's what it's about. What's the most interesting way into it? But it was also quite difficult coming from a copywriting background where you were writing in a brand's tone of voice every day and someone else's voice. So it did take me a while to figure out what my natural tone of voice was. And also because I was pretty angry and bitter when I first started writing the memoir. So my process began with writing down a laundry list of all the ways that my parents hurt me and all the shit things that they did. And then I was like, oh, I already feel a little bit better just having that all down on paper. And then I started writing out like all the funny parts that happened during my coming out process, which is largely set, you know, when I was a teenager from about 16 to 19. And then I guess, yeah, just trying to go, I think that one of the hardest things for me, besides the real fear of repercussions from publishing this, was probably putting the timeline together. Re-exploring everything that happened. When did it happen? Because, you know, you do, if it's been a traumatic time as it was for me, you block things out or you misremember them. So I definitely got stuck sometimes where I was like, did this happen then or there? And also, how does that fit into the story that I'm trying to tell? So it's a pretty interesting process. It's you know, it's not just you're writing, here's what happened, here's what happened, here's what happened. You are really building a narrative. And for me, I was really aware of having an audience and how to make my story interesting for them and not just be, here's what I did next and here's what happened, here's what happened. And I think, interestingly, that came out in my first full, complete draft. As you know, some of the first feedback I had, I was really lucky to get Heather Hogan, who was briefly the managing editor of Autostraddle in the States, which is the world's largest website for queer women, to beta read my book. And she said, you need to trust that the audience is there with you. You know, you can actually tell a story more in full. You know, don't be afraid to write it out and to show what happened. Because I think I was like trying to focus a lot on the sexuality parts, but also, you know, you have to build a scene and slow down and kind of construct the world as well. And that was a lesson that it took me a while to learn.
as you're saying that and talking about memories and things that you might have blocked out, it makes me think of a writer and artist called Linda Barry, who talks about autobio fictionalography, where she's kind of wanting to own the fact that when we talk about our own experiences and autobiography, we also are we shape that narrative because of our own trauma and our own biases and our own subjectivity. And because it pours out of us, we're in some ways becoming our own editor in that process. Is that idea of an autobiofictionalography, does that resonate with either of you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the really big challenge about memoir is that memory is subjective, that there is no objective memory. And I think anyone who tries to paint their memory as objective is potentially manipulative or abusive. And I think that was something I was really, really afraid of, and that actually stopped me from writing for a really long time, because like, as Lil said, you know, like, am I creating memories? Am I manufacturing memories? Who am I to tell this story? And I think particularly when it came to my family and the way that they responded, because it was so deeply personal, I was so afraid that they would deny it, that they would say that never happened, which they did. But the reality is that even though I didn't have receipts and I didn't have evidence that that's exactly how it went down, what I did have was the wounds inside my chest, and that even if that's not exactly how it happened, that is how I've remembered it and how it has damaged and shaped me. Whether that is entirely their responsibility or not is a different question, but I was writing my story. This is my memoir. If someone wants to write their own memoir of the same time period, they can write it however they like and however they experienced it. But this was my story. And I think the process of validating your own voice, when you're a queer person, when that voice has so often been taken away from you, when your representation has been written by cis het people and reproduced and cast with cis het people and reimagined so many times, to actually write yourself into existence is a really powerful process. And I think just understanding that to every nonfiction, there is a little bit of fiction. There kind of has to be, like, there are lines there, but I think even this binary we've created of fiction and nonfiction is false, because so much fiction draws on reality and vice versa. So I think existing within that gray, non-binary space, which is very much what I believe in, is a positive and empowering experience.
Yeah, that's such a good point. The fiction and non-fiction, it's not separate. It never has been. It's like having comedy drama, and it's not, you know, it's dramedy. It's all intertwined. It's interesting you say that, Nevo, because that is actually, I've had to go through a really tough time recently with the publication of my book, of telling my family that I'd written a book after not talking about my sexuality for 16 years in some cases. Like, my mother and I have never once discussed my sexuality. So gearing up for that, ever since I got the publishing contract, has been like probably one of the most difficult times of my life. And what I was afraid of as well is exactly what you said, that they were going to say, that didn't happen. You know, that's not true. You've made that up, and really denying my experience. So when I did tell my sister and my parents, and their reaction, like, my sister read the book, her reaction was initially good, but ultimately not good. But she said, yeah, it's all kind of factually fine. Like, there are a couple of things I remember differently, but, you know, that's fine. It's your story, it's memory. And then when she went on to say all these other things that she didn't like about it and didn't want me to publish it and all this, you know, I just kind of held on to that kernel where she said it was factually fine. And that's kind of all I cared about. I don't know why I was so scared of someone saying you've kind of made all this up, because, yeah, you are trying to recreate events that happened, and the moment you come back to a memory, you change it. The moment you connect it with other memories and create a narrative, you are changing it, and you're putting in print that this is what happened. And, you know, it is one person's story, and of course everyone else has the opportunity to write their own point of view, but they don't, do they, generally?
Yeah.
So it is a really scary thing.
And I think it's also, it comes back to the fact that collectively and societally, queer people have been gaslit. We have had our history erased and rewritten, and then probably experienced that within our families. And so if you have experience of gaslighting throughout your life, then it becomes this awful internalized process where we gaslight ourselves and we're like, that never happened, or maybe it did, but it's not that bad. And there's plenty of other people who have had it worse. And should I really write about it? Like, am I navigating my privilege enough? And that kind of process, I think, that we all go through.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And both of you kind of alluded to in the first question that, as well as within families, within a wider society, particularly, both of you talked about with the media, that you're asked questions on how do you solve homophobia, or can you educate us about what non-binary means? That means that it becomes harder for us to tell our own personal, nuanced stories, that we're always trying to serve a kind of straight, cis-het audience. There's no question there, but...
Yes.
I'm wondering what, when we're telling deeply personal stories, do either of you have thoughts or feelings about what it means to represent a wider group? You know, given that queer voices are marginalised and not represented, and how do you talk from yourself and your own deeply personal experiences, but knowing that you're also speaking on behalf of communities?
Well, I'm just really bad at doing that, at like trying to teach people something, or argue or enlighten people about something. Like there was a time when I was beginning to write the book that I thought it was going to be more of an educational thing. You know, I'd been going into high schools with Rainbow Youth and had kind of seen their gender and sexuality program, and I thought maybe this is going to be more of a educational guide type thing. But I started writing, I was like, oh, I just hate this person. I was like, no one's going to like this person. Like, when you read a book, you really have to be rooting for the protagonist or the narrator, and I just wasn't rooting for myself. So I was like, well, look, the only thing that people can't argue against is talking about your own personal experiences. And I think as long as you're acknowledging that it is your personal experience, that you don't represent the queer community or whatever. And for me, it was also quite important to be aware of my privilege when I was writing about my experiences. Then, yeah, there's nothing, all you can do is, I think people value someone telling someone's vulnerability and someone's honesty. So it's more about someone giving you something of themselves rather than how well they've represented a community. And that's how I justified it to myself, is if I give my full honesty and vulnerability and my heart to this, then I can't actually do any more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, Sam, you've touched on so many important things that we could probably pull apart and tease for a whole hour just on that statement and question. But I guess for me, like, I am a full-time public speaker and educator. I go into workplaces and deliver training around trans identity and allyship, partly because I was expected to do that anyway, so I figured I may as well charge for it. And so I guess for me, there's a lot of disclaimers in that process of saying that I am only an expert in my own story. That is the only thing that I'm an expert in, or that I claim to be an expert in, because no one else is in that story like I am. But I also think when people expect you to be a spokesperson of a community, or they expect your community to be a monolith, that's a teaching moment as well, is that these communities aren't just me, and that my perspective on politics or on identity or on language is not an authority in this at all. And I can just kind of give you this guide, but that you should be grappling with the individuality that exists within communities and marginalized groups, and that's really important to remember, that one person's perspective is not representative. And I think when we do other people, we create this homogeneity that we assume that everyone exists in the same kind of thoughtscape or bubble, which is just not true. So yeah, I think I try to put a lot of disclaimers, and then I think if people still see me as the spokesperson, then maybe that's more representative or reflective on them.
Yeah, I feel like there's such pressure that when we, you know, for outside forces ask us to tell our story and be something that they can kind of feed off of and sensationalize. And then when we own our story, they're like, oh, I don't really
not like that.
Empowered by doing that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I definitely experienced that a lot, I think, when I was first coming out into the media, and the way that journalists were talking about my story and sensationalizing it into this, you know, very typical binary trans pathologized narrative of born in the wrong body. And I did this interview with my mum once that they called it losing a daughter, gaining a son, which is just really gross. And I'm non-binary, so I'm not that. And I think that, yes, cishet people really try, or cis people in general just really try to package deal these kind of stories into before and after. I think we do it a lot with like weight loss journeys and whatever. And it's like, we're not befores and afters. No one is a before and after. We are constantly in flux. We are constantly fluid. We can be before and after a single event, but we are always going to be before another thing, you know, in the future of our life. We live in phases. And so, yeah, I definitely experienced that sensationalizing, and it changed the way I described my own narrative. And it's hard to kind of find your autonomy in that when that story is written for you. And even now I find that, like, when I'm giving speeches and I'm talking about my life, there's a performative vulnerability to it. There are certain like milestones that I pick up on because I know that they are teachable moments. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of what Hannah Gadsby spoke about in Nanette, of kind of cauterizing your story at its trauma points, and that it doesn't really allow you to heal from them because they're these teachable moments. And yeah, it's something I kind of grapple with quite a lot.
Yeah, Lil, as you kind of do the promotion for your book, is that something that you've come across in interviews, or have you been able to find an empowering way to get through that?
It's been a real learning curve, and I felt quite disconnected from my story when I talk about it. A little bit like what Nevo's talking about, is that you think of the points. If I'm preparing for an interview, I think, oh, here's what people might pick up on. And yeah, I feel like I'm not really, I'm talking about a book or experiences and they don't really feel like mine. They're just kind of, I'm like, how do I make sound bites for this? And the questions, I haven't really enjoyed it, to be honest. I feel like there have been the interviews with the mainstream media in particular. I just felt this is boring. Like I'm not really answering any questions that are interesting to me. But then I had to start thinking about, well, how do I actually use this for a purpose? So I realized that very quickly that they were going to ask me a lot about homophobia or coming out and giving advice and all those kind of things. So I had to decide what was my message going to be. And if I was doing a 5-minute live interview with, you know, a radio station in Manawatu or somewhere like a more rural part of New Zealand, then it was an opportunity to get certain messages across, and that I could also take control of my answers, that I didn't have to answer directly what the question was. So if they asked what's some coming out advice, you know, to young people, I'm like, well, young people aren't listening to this, so here's some advice for parents, or here's what I would want. And I'm also I've become quite aware that I am, I guess, quite marketable as an author. And for good or for worse, and I'm aware that my voice as a white cisgender woman has been published, and perhaps is privileged above others. I mean, my publisher, when I had my first interview, when I first met her, she said, "Oh, I Googled you after I got your submission, and you look just like the girl next door." And so I was just kind of like, oh, I'm like, yeah, I've got a publishing contract, but I've started to feel quite aware of, yeah, my position in the world and my privilege. So it's been interesting. I was really looking forward to today to be able to talk about things other than, yeah, those kind of topics that queer, you know, people get asked, and to actually talk about process or to talk about real things, not just, you know, how have your parents reacted.
It's funny you say that, Lil, about the whole marketable thing, because I remember when my book first came out, my publicist associated with the book company was like, oh no, it's a disaster. There's another non-binary author who's just released a book this year. Like, we need to get on top of the publicity now. And I was just like, this is not how this works. I'm not going to do this. And I ended up connecting with that author. We're now best friends. We're writing a book together. We run a trans and gender diverse writing group fortnightly. And we've worked together heaps. And it was just such a funny moment to remember that they were like, no, we've got our non-binary writer of the year. Like, that's it. And it's like, no, I want you to know that we are going to take over the entire publishing industry and the whole world. Like, we are opening that door for everyone else. It is not a quota.
Yeah.
But there is something that the way capitalism and patriarchy works is that we're only allowed to have one of us at a time, and that there's that myth that we're all in competition with each other, and that, you know, it's kind of, it's at once we're all a monolithic group, that we all speak with one clear voice and we have the same politics, and we also are always infighting and hate each other. And it's like, actually, there's something more complicated going on entirely than that.
Well, that's it's like, well, you know, gay men have got queer as folk, and now lesbians have got the L word, and that's that. So that's sorted, and for a while. And it was like, we've already done a lesbian show. We don't need another one. Or, you know, it is a narrative. It's the feeling of it's perceived scarcity, that there's only a certain amount of resources or money to go to anyone. So you have to be, and there's a truth in it, that there is a certain amount of money and resources, but it's really disappointing to think that, you can only have one of each. You could tick a box.
And it goes back to that, like, for how long have queer people been reading themselves into straight narratives? That when, you know, because straight is such a default and white is such a default and upper middle class and all those sorts of things, that people see queer narratives, or they see, you know, empowered POC narratives, and they're like, oh, I can't relate to this. This isn't relevant to me. And it's like, what do you think we've been doing for all of time? Like, we have had to imagine ourselves into these stories because we haven't had representation. It's like, you can do the same thing, actually.
Yeah, Lil, you were writing about that just the other day on the spin-off thing, that you have this ability to make everything gay. And I think that's, as queer people, we do have that ability because we've had to. Yeah,
I love making everything gay. I'm always like, or I can see something, I can sense something gay coming, or there was totally a look there. Or I actually find quite a lot of joy in it. Like, I will always enjoy subtext and creating my own narratives within other stories, even when even when there are actual queer or trans narratives. I'm always, oh, what's going on here? Like, for me, that is the joy of consuming popular culture. And yeah, I just don't understand how, like, I guess like straight people have never had to do that, so they don't have that in their toolbox, perhaps, or although I'm sure they do because they write fan fiction. So I can't actually say that, but yeah.
But they also write a lot of gay fan fiction.
Yeah, they do. They write a lot of, straight women love to write slash fiction, you know, male romances. I actually did a wee talk on it at Verb last year about fan fiction, and I was so surprised to do some research and look at the top fandoms, you know, Marvel and Teen Werewolf and all that. Yeah, driven by straight women. They're into it.
That's so gay.
Who did you write your memoir for? What was the audience you had in mind, or the person?
I think I had two. I think one was the parents and the family members, but the other was absolutely the me, you know, like the young person who doesn't have clarity about their identity, or existing in this gray zone and are feeling like they have to be so certain of who they are, and that actually certainty is a myth, and you know, is so related to toxic masculinity, capitalism, and colonization, and that existing in an ether where you're uncertain about things or where you're allowing fluidity and change is such a special thing. And I just got a lot out of writing to myself, to writing letters to, you know, 16-year-old me, 17-year-old me. Like the very end of my book, spoiler alert, sorry, is there's an afterword, which is a party that I go to with myself at different ages. So I actually gave myself the opportunity to speak to myself at 6, at 13, at 16. And so I think that was the person that kept coming up for me. It was this young person who was just uncertain or scared or hadn't had themselves represented properly in a non-binary kind of way. And that was the person I kept writing for when I kept getting frustrated with the other target audience that was parents and family and having to explain things and tease it out. I liked pivoting back to that person.
Yeah, my answer is number 1, me, and number 2, me. So one, like literal me, I wrote it for me because I felt like I kept carrying these experiences around and they were always at the forefront of my mind kind of, and I just felt like until I wrote them down, then I couldn't put them aside. And I also didn't want to forget all the things that happened. For me, I'm very much a person who, I'm like a memory keeper and I write down notes and all kinds of things, and things, you know, it's not until I go back and write about something in some times that I understand it or that I feel like it's come to mean something, you know, by writing about it, it comes to mean something for me. And then secondly, yeah, I wrote it for the me that was a teenager, that was, you know, starting to have these feelings. And this was, you know, 1999, 2000, 2001. There was, you know, there was the Cruel Intentions kiss, and there was Wild Things, you know, with Denise Richards and Neve Campbell making out in the pool. Not that I, you know, watched it many times or anything. But we didn't have a lot of representation. So it was, and, you know, in my book, I talk a little bit about like frantically searching the library stacks, and there was just lots of academic texts and, you know, covers with, you know, silhouettes of women intertwined on a lavender background, and none of it seemed particularly relevant. So I wrote like the fun book that I wish that I'd had, and one that was really like, but how did you figure it out? But what did you do to figure it out, and how did you feel, and did you feel one way and it was a straight line, or did you go back and forth? Like, I always had searched for those stories that really go into like the process, and I'd never found one that was quite right, that wasn't quite deadly serious, or that didn't skip over everything too fast. So yeah, I mean, I can, when I'm talking to some media, I'm like, the book's for everyone. It's for straight people and it's for parents and blah, blah, blah. And it is, and that I think anyone can find something to relate to in it, because everyone's felt awkward as a teenager, or, you know, come to terms with their sexuality or whatever it is. But I did very much write it in mind with that young person who just wanted to relate to someone else.
I remember I listened to an interview with you on RNZ the other day, and the interviewer was quite shocked, I guess, and sad that you had had an experience with your parents that wasn't good. And it kind of speaks to, I think, a general vibe in the world that everyone's like, oh, it's all better now. And it also touches on that, the Dan Savage kind of thing campaign, that it gets better. My question is, I guess I started thinking about that because you were talking about the process, that no one ever talks about how it gets better or why it gets better, or in fact the pain that our communities are still sitting in, and the importance to be able to share that and tell the stories. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think it was Lynn Freeman, actually. She was a good interviewer as well, but she said, when I read your book, I was like, oh, this feels like it was 40 years ago. And I was like, does it? Because I'm sure that most queer people wouldn't say the same. And I've certainly, from the messages, I've been getting amazing messages from a lot of people saying that they really related to it and had their own experiences. It feels so fresh. It feels like a fresh wound. I feel like, in our community. Obviously I can't speak for everyone, but it's very much there. It's gotten better in some ways, but it's not better. And it's still happening. And I think we do carry a lot of pain around. Like there's been a definite response from the book amongst, you know, readers, and it's not just queer people. It's like, I've had people from my like university years reach out and say, man, I didn't realize you were going through that. And I was also going through this really hard thing. And I was like, we all kind of were going through things. We just don't talk about it. But I think a lot of people are carrying this pain around, and we kind of feel like we just are supposed to get over it and process it ourselves. But in fact, we're all kind of desperate to have an opportunity to talk to other people about it. And which is why we need to keep telling stories, not just writing books, but like telling our stories. There's such a wealth out there, which is why it's ridiculous to think that you can only have one book by a non-binary author or a lesbian author or whatever.
Yeah, I also think sometimes it gets better and sometimes it gets subtler. And I think that's the thing that people don't realize is that, yeah, okay, maybe there's not outright overt homophobia or transphobia in the ways that it used to exist, but that doesn't mean it isn't insidious in every workplace and in every family and in so many different ways, in a way that makes it harder to call out sometimes. Like the kind of microaggressions that I experience as a trans person make me sound crazy when I pull them up. And that is much harder sometimes to speak to than the sort of overt, like getting spat on or slurs on the street. You know, I don't experience that. I experience that sometimes, certainly not in lockdown, which has been quite nice. But, you know, actually like how offended people get by being called transphobic or racist or sexist over the actual institutions of racism, sexism and transphobia. Like if they were as offended by those systems of oppression as they are by being called those names, we would live in a very different world. So I do think that things are very similar now to what they used to be. We've just taken a lot of steps forward and a lot of steps back simultaneously, but it's actually really hard to measure.
That just reminded me of an anecdote. I agree that it is just, sometimes it's like a feeling you have that you just fit, like there was a while in my 20s when I was friends with all these kind of straight couples. I was living with one of them with my partner, and we just always felt a little bit excluded, or like we just felt we felt kind of othered by them, and I can't even really pinpoint what it was that made us feel that way. So there's there's that, but also bigger things still happen, and I have a lot of privilege. I walk through as a straight presenting kind of cisgender white woman, so I don't get a lot of the overt prejudice. But I remember a few years ago, my partner and I were going through fertility treatments, and we in New Zealand you have to have a compulsory counselling session. So we did it with an Australian clinic for IVF. You have to have a compulsory counselling session before you can get signed off to go ahead. And the woman, it was all fine. The woman, the last question was, so do you have straight friends? And we were like, what? And she was like, yeah, do you have like a number of like straight friends and straight couples that you're friends with? So, your child will grow up around straight people as well. And we were like, what?
Do you ask that of straight couples? Do you have a lot of queer friends?
Yeah, exactly.
Have a lot of friends of colour so that this child will grow up with diversity? No? Okay.
No, and I was so shocked at that I was just like dumbstruck. But yeah, that really stayed with me. I was like, wow, what a question. And it's almost like, I don't know, I feel like she's just reading off a list. How long has that question been around? Whether it's, been around for a while or they've kind of come up with it recently. Either way, it's just shocking. But,
wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that whole process, I have some friends who've gone through that, and the fact that donors have to opt in to donate to queer couples and things like that. Like there's some...
Whoa, I did not know that.
Wow. Yeah.
And you can feel it, right, Sam?
I apologise.
But Sam, I can feel that, like recounting that. It's all so close to the surface. Yeah.
Go on, and I want to carry a baby one day. Let's see how that goes.
Oh God. Wow.
I mean, I guess this is a good point to talk about catharsis and the empowering process of owning your own story and the autonomy to which that happens when you write your own memoir. Lil, you had that experience of coming out taken away from you, I guess, because you were outed through your parents overhearing a conversation. What is it like to own your story and go through that process to say, this is my reality and I'm not going to be gaslit?
It's been really mixed. I mean, I think my whole coming out experience has been mixed, because I had that part of the coming out experience, like of my coming out, taken away from me with my parents, but I'd also spent, a good couple of years coming out to myself. And I'd been to like a coming out group, and I'd come out like to some friends and then all friends. So I'd had this really, really positive experience. But then I had a terrible experience that when I was outed to my parents. So I was kind of holding those two things. And now I feel like with the publishing of the book, it's the same. I feel really empowered, and writing it down felt so good. And I'm like, it's here, it's on the page, you can't, someone published it, it's real now. But also feeling like this has kind of been a cycle of trauma that's come back around for me, and I have been quite re-traumatized by having to bring this up with my family, and to have some of them react in a way that is very reminiscent of all those years ago. And for me, it's been really difficult to kind of lose contact with my sister because of the book, and for her to choose to deal with it by avoiding it and saying, I don't want to be a part of this. And that was just eerily familiar with my mother doing the same thing. Like, I don't want to talk about it, shove it down, I've got other things to think about, just don't bring it up. And so I feel it's been really sad. So it's been empowering, but also a really sad experience. I feel like I've kind of paid the price for doing this, feeling so great. So I'm feeling the best and I'm feeling the worst.
Yeah, I couldn't relate to that more. I wrote my dad off after his reaction to my book, and it was just sort of like the last straw for me. Yeah, I don't know. It's a weird thing, I think, writing memoir. Like, I'm really grateful for it. I really had imagined when I finished the book that I would be closing the book on those chapters of my life and moving on, and that's totally not what happened at all. I ended up building a career off that, which I'm very grateful for and I'm really happy to have, but that revolves completely around that storytelling, which means I never really get to move past it. That I'm still reminded about those behaviors with my siblings and with my mom, and the things they say and do, I think, scratch and hit me in more acute ways. I mean, I think family presses our buttons no matter what, but I don't think I'm as patient with them as maybe I would be if I wasn't retelling this story over and over again and remembering it constantly. So I feel like really grateful for these experiences in this career. I also simultaneously feel really resentful that I like have to do that, and that that pain exists in my body a lot and that I can't fully move on from it. It's a weird place to exist in. I wouldn't necessarily want things to be different, but I think I need to hold space for the pain and the re-traumatizing that brings, and what it means to be able to write a different story outside of those walls and those restrictions, which is why I've moved into fiction now. And I really enjoy, like, for example, I write a lot of characters that have really soft, masculine, gentle fathers. And I find that really healing, actually, to write these like beautiful single dads who are just nothing like my own. And so I think, kind of doing the memoir thing and then also getting to do the fiction thing and fill in all the other parts of the story in different ways has been really beautiful.
Lovely. Both of you have talked about going into schools and talking with young people and kind of sharing your story with potentially kind of emerging queers, I guess. Is that something that you both had in mind when you were writing memoir? aside, both of you have talked about writing for yourself, but also, is there something in you that writes to the next generation who may have quite different experiences or similar experiences going forward?
I was, one of my goals with the book, even when I thought, you know, if it doesn't get published in a traditional way, if I self-publish it, I just want to get it into high schools, or I want to get it in the hands of young people. That was like, I've never really cared about anything else apart from it meaning something to even one person, I said, you know, and I do think of that young person. And I think, but I'm also looking forward to, you know, I'm 36 now. I think there's a lot that's relevant in my story and universal, but I think I certainly don't want it to be their Bible, like the only thing. And because, you know, it just amazes me with all the things that there are there. So I kind of want it to be really useful to someone, but also not eventually not needed as such.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought about what speaking to young people would look like, because that's all I've ever really cared about or wanted to do. Is they're my main priority in the world, is young people, and I love them so dearly. I think they're so incredible and wacky and way smarter than I am, and way more engaged in queer politic than I am sometimes. And I was doing that kind of work before the book came out anyway, so getting to write a book and kind of get into schools in that way was really great, especially when I was getting a lot of backlash from the Australian Christian Lobby and other sort of awful groups. Getting into school as an author was a really good way in. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've had some of the most incredible, heart-wrenching experiences with teenagers through speaking at their schools and through writers' festivals, where they've told me, you know, that they've come out because of my book, or they've given my book to their parents and then they didn't have to explain everything. I had a kid tell me that they brought my book home from school and their mum found it and burnt it.
Oh.
It was copy, which for me was a pretty like weird amalgamation of my identities as like a Jew and a trans person. Like, to have my book burnt with my kind of like intergenerational trauma was a really interesting point. But it made me feel pretty damn radical that my book was worthy of burning. It's a pretty nice book. Like, it's not even super, you know, like it's not a call to arms or anything. But yeah, so I think having those connections with young people and getting to be that person that they can look to. I didn't have any kind of representation growing up. I certainly didn't have non-binary people who spoke about gender with the kind of fluidity and flux that I think that I do, and the sort of gender thinking that I think that I try to embody, at least, and the comfort with femininity and like not having to conform to these like rigid gender stereotypes. I think that's always what I wanted to be. I wanted to be the person for young people that I never had growing up. And I think that's what I'm constantly striving to be, is I want to make them proud. I want to make them represented well, and I want to make them feel empowered.
That's lovely. Yeah, I guess something I think about quite often is that, you know, when I was growing up, I was trying to find lesbian and bi women on TV and in films and in books, and there's been more of that over the last 20 years, but I feel like as a trans and non-binary person, that's still lacking, and it's still something that when I was coming out to my mum, she knew what lesbian meant, and so that coming out was easier, but when I came out as trans and non-binary, that was much more difficult for her to get her head around, because she hadn't seen any representation of that. Is that your experience too, Nevo?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, in some ways, as much as I want to like queer this narrative, but in some ways I was like textbook trans. Like, told my parents I was trans when I was 4. I was like, I'm a boy, don't call me a drama queen, I'm a drama king. You know, just like very clearly presenting as a boy for 5 years of my life as a kid. And that's like a pretty significant amount of time, I think. And it didn't even cross my parents' mind that I could be trans. Like gender diversity was not even on the radar. They were just like, oh, she'll probably grow up to be a lesbian. But I was 5, you know, like being 5 years old has nothing to do with sexuality really to other people. It wasn't about that. It was about who I was. So yeah, I think my parents really, really struggled with that. And I often talk about parents as kind of GPS systems. I think maybe Lil, you'll relate to this a little bit, but they have these like set destinations for where we're going to be. And, you know, throughout your life, and I think everyone does this because of generational shifts and whatever, but we all take twists and turns that kind of reroute the GPS, and they have to still figure out ways for you to get back and become a doctor or a lawyer, or like get married and have kids, or please just get off the couch one day, like whatever. They've got some kind of set thing. And yeah, we do these rerouting processes. And I think when I came out as trans, that's when the GPS just exploded. They were like, you know, when I came out as a lesbian, my mum was like, okay, I guess you could still get married and have kids, which I didn't realize I'd signed a contract to do anyway. So she was kind of like, all right, that's fine, as long as the girls that you date are Jewish. And I was 15. I was like, the only Jewish lesbians I know are in their 40s. Like, is that what you want from me? But yeah, there was no representation of what my life could look like as a man or as a non-binary person. There was no one to look to. And I think she went through that, but I think that I also went through that as queers, sometimes we are constantly deconstructing, queering the status quo. And that is a really powerful and amazing thing. But sometimes what you're left with is just rubble, and you don't have any blueprints to rebuild. What does reconstructing look like after the deconstruction? Who do we have to look to? Do we have intergenerational relationships? You know, like, do we have communities where we can rely upon other people to set some of those standards and to build together? And I think that's something, like, there's been a lot of grief in that for me, is this kind of deconstructing process, and then sort of looking around and being like, okay, well, what am I left with now? What else do I have?
We are coming to the end of our session, and I thought that I would throw open to our audience for some Q&A. If you want to ask some questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. We have one from earlier where Kay says that some authors use autobiographical content to write fiction. Maybe that's to protect real life people or because of other choices. But did either of you consider that when writing your own memoir, to kind of do a loosely inspired by but be able to change the content to fictionalize it?
Yes, it was going to be called Lay Girls. This is a really funny question because my sister begged me not to publish the book, and then when I said, sorry, I've got to, she said, well, can you at least take a year or two and rewrite it as fiction? Which was just so ludicrous to me. It was just not even, it was just absolutely laughable. I don't know. I think the first time I've ever written like a book, well, actually I've written a fan fiction, but the first time I've written a long fiction, well, it's not a fiction, sorry, memoir, but a long piece of writing. I couldn't write apart from for myself and about myself. I didn't feel like I had the skill to do that yet. And also it was just such a personal story. There's no way I could have written this fiction. But watch out, because I think fiction's going to be the next one, because I've pissed way too many people off.
Don't worry, you can still piss people off with fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was never an option for me, I don't think. I think I needed to, I feel like it would have been maybe in some ways an easy out from the like validating my own memory to just be like, oh, well, it doesn't matter, it's fiction anyway. It's like, no, it's not fiction. This is true. And whether it's not true for everyone doesn't mean it's not true for me. This is my truth, and I have to put my truth on the page. And now that I've done that, I feel like I have the freedom to put my truth on the page in different and more creative and world-building ways. And I can add in elements of my story that didn't get into the original book because they weren't part of that, or I can talk about certain aspects of my relationships with my mom or my dad or something that were really positive, but that didn't make sense within that narrative, you know what I mean? And so now I get to feed that into other books that I work on.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting. The idea of memoir as a gateway to fiction. I've got no questions coming through, just some like wonderful thank you from people saying thank you for such articulate, intelligent, empathetic, generous panelists, wonderful and inspiring session. A question here is wondering if the process of writing has politicized either of you.
I think I've always been pretty political. I think my body is political. I think my body existing in any space is political. I don't think it politicized me. I think it changed the authorship of that politic. Rather than someone else politicizing me, it was politicizing myself.
I've always kind of shied away from being too political, to be honest. But I think especially with everything that's going on in the world, I'm starting to realize that that's not good enough. So I think writing the memoir for me was just very internally focused, but moving forward, I am going to be looking to, politicizing myself more and being more aware of what I choose to write and where I write it.
Wonderful. The last question there's lots coming up now. Sorry if I missed yours. Is it still useful to write a memoir if your experience has been mostly positive? Says someone.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's not, there's always going to be someone who had it worse than you or had it a more dramatic time than you. I'm a pretty average person. Not that much crazy stuff has happened to me. And that's just your self-doubt. That's just your imposter syndrome or whatever it is, like everyone's got a story to tell. It's all about how you tell the story.
Yeah, I think when it comes to transness as well, we're starting to see a pretty radical shift from these kind of tragedy narratives and this gender dysphoria into gender euphoria, because I don't think it takes gender dysphoria to realize that you're trans, and not every trans person does have dysphoria, but I would say probably every trans person has experienced a moment of gender euphoria, what it feels like to be gendered correctly or to feel seen and heard and belonging somewhere. And so I'm actually a part of a cabaret burlesque variety show called Gender Euphoria. That's the largest all trans cast to be on a main stage in Australia. And so we've done a few seasons.
Can we get you over to New Zealand as well?
We would love that one day that we can travel. But yeah, so we do a show that is all about kind of celebrating what it means to be trans, because it is overwhelmingly positive and exciting and beautiful. And I mean, queer parties are the best parties. There's a reason why Hens Nights are always at gay clubs. Like, we have a beautiful and incredible community around us. And I think getting to see and celebrate that is really, really important.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful note to leave it on. We have just come up to time. I want to say a massive thank you to Lil and Nevo for talking with us, and hopefully I didn't ask too many boring questions.
They were all great.
You've given such generous and incredible answers, and not even one-word answers even once. So thank you very much. And once again, thank you to Creative New Zealand who sponsored us. You can, if you want to watch reruns of any of the events that we posted these weekends, head over to our Facebook page and look in the events section, and you'll be able to find the replays on the discussion section. We'll also try and pop them up online on our website. But thank you again for coming along, for sharing yourselves and telling more queer stories. It's so important.
Thank you. Follow us on social media and buy Lil's book.
Yes, buy the books.
And read Sam's amazing comics.
Yes, read my comics, buy all the books, share all the stories, write your own, do the things.